Okay, let's unpack this. Sometimes you think about the most fundamental sort of behind-the-scenes parts of your computer system, the pieces you rarely even think about the ones just quietly doing their job until, well, something goes terribly wrong. Well, it turns out even those can hide secrets, the kind of secrets attackers would absolutely love to get their hands on.
That's exactly right. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some recent findings about vulnerabilities actually residing in the tools Linux uses to handle system crashes. Think of them as the systems, like digital black boxes, capturing exactly what happened when a program just failed unexpectedly.
And this deep dive into all the details today is sponsored by Stonefly. Stonefly is a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. So if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage. You can contact sales at stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
Yeah, and these findings, they reveal specific flaws that could potentially allow attackers, assuming they already have, local access to a system, to get their hands on highly sensitive information that's usually locked away in these crash reports. We're going to walk you through exactly what these tools are, how these particular vulnerabilities work, who is affected, and crucially, what can be done about it.
All right, so let's start right at the beginning then. When a program crashes on Linux, something called a core dump happens. What exactly is that?
Okay, so a core dump is essentially a complete snapshot of a program's memory at the precise moment it crashed. It's kind of like freezing the scene of an accident for the investigators, which, in the tech world means developers trying to debug and figure out what went wrong. It captures everything, the program's state, variables, the entire contents of its memory at that instant.
And that's why this can be so dangerous, right? Because if the program was handling sensitive stuff when it crashed, all that sensitive stuff is now just frozen in time in that dump file.
Exactly, yeah. If a program was processing or maybe just holding confidential data, could be passwords, encryption keys, maybe even customer records when it crashed, all of that can potentially end up right there in the core dump file. And for this very reason, access to core dumps is normally really restricted. Usually only the root user on the system can actually read them.
Okay, got it. A core dump is the raw, sensitive data. So the tools we're looking at here are the handlers for these dumps, the programs that manage them.
Precisely. They're the programs designed to collect, process, and store these core dumps and related crash information. The two major ones that these findings focus on are apport, which is the default crash handler you'd find on Ubuntu, and systemd-coredump. Systemd-coredump is widely used across many other distributions. Think Fedora, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SEC, Arch Linux, places like that. Their job is pretty critical, reliably capturing this data when something goes south.
What's really fascinating here, though, is that the underlying problem in both apport and systemd-coredump, even though they're different programs, it seems to revolve around the same type of vulnerability. These things called race conditions.
Yes, that's right. They're tracked as CVE-2025-5054 for the apport issue and CVE-2025-4598 for the one in systemd-coredump.
A race condition always sounds, well, tricky. Is it like trying to do two things at the exact same instant?
That's a pretty good way to think about it, yeah. In a security context, it means exploiting a tiny, really fleeting window of time. The system performs some kind of check, maybe it's verifying permissions or confirming the identity of a process, something like that. And then based on the results of that check, it proceeds to take an action. A race condition exploit happens when an attacker manages to manipulate the system state between the check and the action. They basically trick the system into acting on outdated or, incorrect information.
Okay, so the system thinks everything is secure based on the check it just did, but the attacker changed something critical in that split second before the system actually does the secure thing.
That's exactly the core idea, yeah. The conditions the system checked for are no longer actually true by the time it executes the next step. And it's really worth reinforcing here that these vulnerabilities, they require local access. An attacker needs to already be on the system. They need some level of user access to even attempt this. The official CVSS score reflects its medium, around 4.7. But as we'll get into, the potential impact on confidentiality, well, that's quite significant because of the kind of data that can be exposed.
Okay, let's really dive into how these races work then. Maybe start with apport in that CVE-2025-5054. How does an attacker exploit its mechanism?
Right, so apport. When a privileged process crashes, its job is to analyze the crash and forward the core dump appropriately. Now, one of the checks apport performs, and it does this relatively early on, is trying to detect if the crashing process was running inside, like a container environment. This happens before it even gets to its main security checks.
And the attacker abuses that specific sequence, the timing.
Precisely. So the attacker first needs to trigger a crash in a privileged program, one that runs with elevated permissions, like an SUID or SGID process. A common example used in the research is Unix CVE-2025-5054. It's a little helper program the system uses, often when verifying user passwords, so it definitely handles sensitive data. Okay, so once that privilege process crashes, the attacker basically races against apport's processing. They have to very quickly terminate the actual crash process and then replace it with a different process that they control. And this attacker-controlled process, it's specifically set up in a separate user namespace, mount namespace, and PID namespace, essentially creating this isolated environment. And importantly, it's running with full capabilities within that isolated namespace.
Wow. Okay, so the attacker literally swaps out the original crashed privileged process with their own process running in this kind of specially crafted isolated environment.
Yes. And the timing, it's absolutely everything. By the time apport gets around to its check about whether the process is in a container, it's now looking at the attacker's replacement process. And that replacement process is running within a namespace. So this fools apport into believing the original privileged process was containerized. And because apport thinks it's dealing with a containerized process, it then tries to forward the core dump, which, remember, is the sensitive dump from the original privileged process that the kernel was still busy generating. It tries to forward that dump into the attacker-controlled namespace.
And then the attacker just reads the core dump from inside their own namespace.
That's the end goal, yes. They've essentially used the race condition and that container check bypass to redirect highly sensitive data into an environment they fully control and can access freely. And this particular vulnerability, it affects apport in Ubuntu 24.04 and essentially all versions stretching way back to 16.04, specifically apport versions up to 2.33.0.
Wow. Okay, so it's really about making apport misinterpret the environment because the process got swapped out midstream. Now, what about systemd-coredump and CVE-2025-4598? Is the race similar there, or is it a different kind of trick?
It's also a race condition, definitely, but it targets a different part of systemd-coredump's logic. You see, systemd-coredump automatically captures core dumps for pretty much all processes, but it has its own set of strict checks specifically designed to prevent non-root users from reading core dumps of privileged processes.
Okay, so where's the timing window for the attacker in that scenario?
So again, an attacker crashes a privileged SUID process. Unix Stappalet is a good example here, too. Then in another rapid race, they replace that crashed process, but this time with a non-SUID process. And the critical part is doing this before systemd-coredump finishes its analysis of the original crash process. That analysis includes checking its attributes, like whether it was SUID or what user and group IDs it was running under.
All right, I think I'm following. So systemd-coredump starts looking at the original privileged process, but the attacker manages to swap it out before systemd-coredump finishes its security checks. Then systemd-coredump finishes its checks, but it's looking at the new, safe-looking, non-SUID process.
Exactly. By the time systemd-coredump actually completes its checks on the process it's now observing, which is the attacker's harmless-looking non-SUID replacement process, well, that replacement process passes the checks just fine. It's not SUID, and the user and group checks probably align with the attacker's own context. So systemd-coredump then mistakenly grants read access. But the crucial point is, the file it's granting access to is the core dump of the original privilege process that the kernel was still writing out in the background.
So really, both vulnerabilities hinge on that split-second timing swapping out the process to fool the crash handler's security checks before they complete.
Yeah. That's the absolute core of it. It's a classic time of check to time of use, or TOCTOU flaw. And this systemd-coredump vulnerability, it affects distributions that use it, which includes Fedora 40 and 41, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 9, and the upcoming RHEL 10. It's probably worth noting, though, that if you're primarily using Debian, you're likely not affected by default. Debian doesn't typically include systemd-coredump unless you've specifically gone and installed it yourself.
Okay, so we understand the mechanisms now, these tricky race conditions. But what's the real-world consequence? I mean, what could an attacker actually steal with this?
Well, the primary impact is gaining access to that highly sensitive data captured in the process memory snapshot. Like we discussed with Unix CVE-WD, this could directly expose things like password hashes, maybe read directly from the system's etc. shadow file, if that process had access.
And it probably goes beyond just password hashes, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Depending entirely on what that crashed privileged process was actually doing at the time, that core dump could contain Encryption keys, API keys, maybe other secrets held in memory, or even sensitive customer data if it was, say, a web server process handling that information. And there was also an interesting additional discovery specifically for the systemd core dump case. It might also be possible to dump memory from certain root processes, specifically those that start as root but then fork and drop privileges later on. Exploiting that could potentially expose bits and pieces of other sensitive data, like maybe half of the system's SSH host keys, or the contents of other users' cron tabs, or even internal system details like ASLR addresses and stack canaries. These are techniques normally designed to make other types of memory exploits harder, but they could potentially be revealed here.
This really seems quite significant. I mean, these crash handlers, they're often just seen as like plumbing, right? Background utilities. Are they a generally overlooked attack surface?
They absolutely seem to be, yeah. This really highlights that even components primarily designed for system stability or, developer convenience can become really high-value targets, especially if they interact with privileged processes in ways that weren't fully anticipated, like with these timing issues. And exploiting these race conditions, it's actually a pretty clever way to bypass standard runtime memory protection controls. Because you're not directly corrupting memory in the traditional sense, you're getting unauthorized access to the memory contents after the fact, captured in the dump.
So the potential consequences, if an attacker successfully pulls this off,
Yeah.
could be quite severe then.
Definitely. Unauthorized access to this kind of data, it can easily enable a local attacker to escalate their privileges on the system. They could potentially move laterally to other systems on the network, maybe cause operational disruption if systems need to be taken offline for investigation. And of course, it could lead to significant reputational damage, not to mention creating compliance headaches depending on the type of data exposed.
Right. Okay, so this is serious stuff. What should listeners who might be running these affected systems actually do about it? What's the fix?
Well, the most important step, really the strongest protection, is to apply the vendor security updates as soon as they become available. Canonical for Ubuntu and Fedora and Red Hat have already released or are actively preparing patches that directly fix these race conditions in the vulnerable software. Patching is key.
What if, for some reason, patching isn't immediately an option? Is there anything people can do in the meantime to sort of mitigate the risk?
Yes, there is a mitigation available, but it's really crucial to understand the trade-off involved. You can set a specific kernel parameter. It's called process_sets_to_dumpable, and you set it to the value 0.
Okay, fs.sudodumpable equals 0. And what exactly does setting that to 0 do?
It effectively disables core dumps entirely for all programs that run with SUID or SGID permissions, and it also disables them for those root daemons we mentioned, the ones that fork and drop privileges.
So for the specific vulnerabilities we've been talking about, it would basically prevent the core dump from ever happening in the first place for those privileged processes.
Exactly. It neutralizes these specific attack vectors quite effectively by simply cutting off the source. No sensitive core dump is generated for those privileged programs. However, and this is the significant trade-off, it means that if one of your critical SUID or privilege programs crashes for any reason, even a legitimate bug, you won't get a core dump to help you debug why it crashed. It prevents legitimate debugging for those processes too. So it's a strong temporary measure if you need it, but the goal should always be to apply the proper vendor patch as soon as you can.
Are there other, maybe more general security practices that could help here as well, alongside patching?
Oh, absolutely. Good security hygiene is always beneficial, right? Things like robust monitoring to detect any unusual activity on your systems, tightening your general access controls wherever possible. Being mindful of who actually has access to the core dump directories themselves. That's often varlib apport core dump or varlib system core dump. Auditing local user activity can also help spot suspicious behavior. And thinking more proactively, some people have suggested ideas like processing core dumps within more isolated environments, or perhaps even encrypting them right from the start to better protect the data they contain.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for you, the listener.
Right. If you're running Ubuntu or Fedora, RHEL, or potentially other Linux distributions that might be using systemd core dump, definitely check your versions against the affected lists we mentioned.
And your absolute top priority should be applying those security updates as soon as they're released by the vendors. That is the direct, proper fix.
And if immediate patching really isn't possible for some reason, you can consider that temporary sudodumpable equals 0 mitigation. But please make sure you fully understand the impact they'll have on debugging any privilege crashes you might encounter later.
And really, maybe take this as a prompt to think about your own systems more broadly. Are they fully updated across the board? Are you truly aware of all the background components running, even the ones you rarely interact with directly, like these crash handlers? Security really does require looking closely at, well, every single layer of the stack.
To summarize it all, we've seen how these really subtle flaws stemming from intricate timing issues and specific configurations within essential Linux crash handling tools like apport and systemd-coredump, how they created these unexpected openings. Vulnerabilities that could allow local attackers to potentially access highly sensitive data from process memory just by exploiting race conditions. It's a really powerful reminder, I think, that security demands vigilance across the entire system stack, including all those less obvious, often overlooked pieces.
And here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. Consider how many other hidden, maybe less scrutinized components exist in the complex systems we rely on every day. What other secrets might they be waiting to reveal if they're poked in just the right way, at just the right time? And, what happens when tools originally built for developer convenience or just basic system stability suddenly become prime targets for exploitation? Something to think about.
And remember, this deep dive was made possible by Stonefly. Stonefly is a leader in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. For secure, ransomware-proof storage, definitely check out their air-gapped and immutable solutions. You can contact sales at stonefly.com to schedule a demo.